5 times they sent her back. 5 times, Sarah Chen stepped off a train in Wyoming, a mail-order bride full of quiet hope. And 5 times, they put her right back on that same train to San Francisco, with the same brutal words scratched on a note. Too quiet. In 1885, out on the frontier, silence wasn't a virtue. It was a verdict, a sentence to a life alone. No one cared that her silence was a language of its own, that her hands told stories when she tended a garden, that the ink on her journal pages sang with a voice louder than any shout. They wanted a wife who could haggle and holler. Sarah Chen was quiet. Then came the 6th time, a final desperate chance with a man who had his own unique circumstances. A deaf rancher named James Mallister, who had lived his whole life in a world where words were things you saw, not heard, where the truest feelings were read in the lines of a face, not the sound of a voice. What if the very thing that made her an outcast to everyone else made her perfect for him? The San Francisco fog was thick and cold as the train whistle screamed. Sarah Chen clutched her leather journal to her chest, the worn cover a familiar comfort. 5 journeys, 5 failures, each one a fresh scar on her spirit. She watched the porters unload her single trunk, the same one she'd packed with trembling hope just 3 weeks prior. Mrs. Sullivan from the marriage agency was waiting. Her face was a mask of tired sympathy. She'd been shipping Chinese brides west for 15 years and had never, not once, had one returned like a spoiled bolt of cloth. Not 5 times. "Perhaps, dear," Mrs. Sullivan said, her voice gentle but firm, "it's time we consider other paths." Sarah's fingers tightened on her journal. Inside, her real voice lived. Elegant Chinese characters and carefully practiced English script filled the pages, a testament to everything she couldn't force. Past her lips. "Mr. Patterson wrote that you were a ghost at his dinner table," Mrs. Sullivan sighed, leading her back to the office that smelled of stale hope and old paper. "He needs a woman who can manage a household, direct the hands, charm the merchants in town." Sarah remembered Mr. Patterson's face, the way his frustration grew with each passing, silent moment. How could she explain that where she came from, her silence was seen as grace? That her mother taught her to watch, to listen, to understand the world before daring to speak into it? In the office, the 5 rejection letters were laid out on the desk like cards in a losing hand. Each one stamped with an angry red "Return to sender." "You're a beautiful, educated girl, Sarah," Mrs. Sullivan said, her patience wearing thin. "But America chews up quiet girls and spits them out. Perhaps it is best you return to China." Sarah opened her journal to a page she had prepared. Her hand trembled as she pushed it across the desk. The calligraphy was perfect, a stark contrast to the fear in her heart. "I cannot go back," the journal read. "My family gave everything for this. I will try again. Please." Mrs. Sullivan read the words, then looked into Sarah's unblinking eyes. There was a steel in that gaze she hadn't seen before, a refusal to break. Sarah pushed another paper forward, a detailed sketch of the Wyoming landscape drawn from the train window. Jagged mountains clawing at a vast sky. In the margin she'd written, "Land of Big Sky, a place where silence can speak." A flicker of something, pity or perhaps respect, crossed Mrs. Sullivan's face. "There is one more," she said, almost to herself. "A rancher near a town called Laram, James Mallister. He's asked for a bride before, but he has his own unique circumstances." She paused. "Are you willing, Sarah? One last time?" Sarah nodded. No hesitation. One more journey into the heart of the country that kept rejecting her. "Very well," Mrs. Sullivan said, pulling out a fresh contract. "But this is the last one, for both our sakes." As the papers were signed, Sarah opened her journal to a clean page. 6th journey, she wrote. Final chance. The mountains call again. Outside, the San Francisco fog began to burn away, revealing a sliver of impossible blue. She didn't know it yet, but out there, under that big sky, a man was waiting. A man who would not ask her to speak, but only to be seen. James Mallister didn't hear the train's approach. He felt it. A low, deep vibration that traveled from the tracks up through the wooden planks of the station platform and into the soles of his boots. His pencil danced across the page of his sketchbook, capturing the faces that emerged from the steam. A tired mother, a nervous salesman, a young couple clinging to each other. 20 years of profound silence had taught him to see the stories everyone else only heard. The station master, Henry, clapped him on the shoulder, the familiar signal for a delivery. James nodded, tucking the sketchbook away. The ranch always needed supplies. He timed his runs to meet the passenger train, finding it easier to conduct his business when the town was distracted by new arrivals. His art was his voice, his sketchbook, a chronicle of Laram. He'd drawn the baker's daughter from a gap-toothed child to a young woman. He'd charted the sheriff's deepening worry lines through the long drought. His drawings told the town's story, one silent observation at a time. Henry pointed toward the supply cart, but something else had caught James's eye. A young Chinese woman stepping from the passenger car. She moved with a grace and a stillness that was different from the others. She wasn't chattering or calling out greetings. She was moving in a small bubble of silence, her eyes taking in everything. Those were the eyes of a watcher, the eyes of someone who understood the world without needing it to scream in her ear. He made a quick sketch, the delicate curve of her neck, the careful way she held her small trunk. There was a story in her posture, in the spaces between her movements. He knew those spaces well. They were where the most important words lived. She glanced his way, and for a heartbeat, their eyes locked. He saw a flicker of recognition, not of his face, but of his stillness. A shared language of watching. Then Henry was waving again, more insistently this time, pointing at the waiting crates. James closed his sketchbook and got to work. But as he loaded his wagon, he kept glancing back. She stood apart from the crowd, a solitary figure waiting, watching. Just like him. He was loading the last of the flour when he saw the commotion. The station master was approaching the woman, a telegram in his hand. James saw her read it, saw the slight, almost imperceptible sag of her shoulders. He knew that look. It was the look of a door slamming shut. She opened a journal, preparing to write, when James found himself moving toward her. He didn't know why. He just knew he had to. He stood before her, a shadow falling across her page. He pointed to the telegram, then to himself. He tapped his ear and shook his head. Understanding dawned in her eyes. He was deaf. She hesitated only for a second before turning to a fresh page and writing, "My intended match has changed his mind. I must return to San Francisco." Another rejection. The story in her eyes was one he understood all too well. He pulled a small worn book from his coat, not the sketchbook. It was a manual for sign language. He flipped to a page and pointed to the illustration for hello, then formed the sign with his own calloused hand. Her slender fingers mimicked the gesture, hesitantly at first, then with a surprising grace. A smile broke across James's face, a rare thing that lit up his weathered features. He scribbled in his own notebook, "I'm James Mallister. Would you like to learn more?" The station master, watching them, cleared his throat. "Mr. Mallister, didn't you send an inquiry to the marriage agency some months back?" James nodded, his eyes never leaving Sarah's as she studied the sign language book. She looked up and signed, "Hello," again, adding a small formal bow from her homeland. He wrote again, his script quick and decisive. "I have a ranch. It's not fancy. I need someone who understands that words aren't everything. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She took her journal back and wrote, "Everyone says I am too quiet." James smiled. Then his hands moved in a flurry of signs, too fast for her to follow. He wrote, "I think you speak perfectly." This was it. A choice. Another train ride back to failure, or a leap into a silence that felt different. She looked at his kind eyes, at the book he held out to her like a key. She wrote in her journal, her hand surprisingly steady. "Could I see the ranch first?" His response was immediate. "Of course. No promises. Just two people learning a new language." As James loaded her small trunk into his wagon, whispers followed them like flies. The deaf rancher, the Chinese girl, can't hear, can't speak. What a pair. For the first time, the whispers didn't cut her. He helped her onto the wagon seat and handed her the sign language book. In return, she handed him her journal. A trade, her words for his. As they pulled away from the station master was already writing a telegram of his own to Mrs. Sullivan. "Circumstances altered. Stop. Miss Chen found promising alternative. Stop. Do not send return ticket. Stop." The sun was a pale lemon slice in the Wyoming sky. In James's kitchen, a Chinese-English dictionary lay open next to the sign language manual. Sarah traced a character with her finger, then carefully signed the word for tea. James watched, his eyes missing nothing, and mimicked the sign perfectly. Their first week together was a silent ballet. Mornings were for simple signs. Good morning, hungry, thank you. Afternoons were spent in the garden, where she discovered familiar herbs from her homeland growing wild among the western vegetables. Each plant became a new word in their shared vocabulary. James wrote in his notebook, "Your signs are graceful." She smiled and wrote the Chinese character for grace beneath his words, then mimed its meaning, the flow of water over stones. He nodded, understanding completely. The kettle on the stove began to whistle. James didn't hear it, but he saw the steam and moved to take it off the heat. Sarah prepared the tea using the formal set she'd brought from San Francisco, her one small luxury. He had cleared a special shelf for it, recognizing its importance, without a single word being exchanged. As she was pouring, he touched her arm and pointed out the window. Old Mrs. Henderson, his neighbor, was making her way up the path. Sarah's hands trembled. New people, the hardest part. James scribbled a note. "She is kind, but very curious. Show her your way of making tea, the real way." Mrs. Henderson's weathered face peeked through the open door. Her eyes widened at the sight of the formal tea service, but her smile was warm. "Well now, James," she said, speaking slowly so he could read her lips. "Aren't you getting civilized?" Sarah bowed and gestured to a chair. As she performed the tea ceremony, her nervousness melted away. This was a language she knew. Mrs. Henderson watched, captivated by the precision and grace of the ritual. After her first sip, her eyes lit up. "Land's sakes, I've been drinking tea my whole life, and it seems I've been doing it all wrong." James grinned and signed to Sarah. She was beginning to recognize his common expressions. She wrote in her journal and showed it to them both. "Tea is meant for sharing with friends." Mrs. Henderson pointed to the beautiful Chinese characters. "That's some mighty pretty writing. Could you teach me how to make those marks?" For the next hour, the kitchen became a school. Sarah demonstrated how to paint the characters for friend and harmony. James added the corresponding signs. As Mrs. Henderson left, clutching a small packet of the special tea, she paused. "You two," she said, her voice full of approval. "You seem to be figuring things out just fine. Sometimes the Lord knows what we need better than we do." But as she walked down the path, Sarah saw her glance back, a flicker of worry in her eyes. It was a look that said this small piece they were building was fragile, and that something outside this quiet ranch was waiting to break it. The ranch ledger was a testament to James's mind. Neat columns, precise handwriting. Every rainfall, every foal, every sack of grain was accounted for. This was why his ranch thrived. It was a story told in numbers. In the 3 weeks she'd been there, Sarah had begun adding her own notes in the margins. Observations written in a mix of English and Chinese, with small diagrams showing which horses responded to a gentler touch, which fields held the morning dew the longest. James had simply smiled when he saw them, incorporating her notes into his plans. This morning, they were in the stables. He was teaching her the story of each horse through sign. Thunder, his main stallion, had been born the same year scarlet fever had stolen James's hearing. They had learned to speak to each other through touch and vibration. Sarah approached a nervous mare, humming a low Chinese lullaby. It wasn't for the sound, but for the vibration. She felt it in her own chest, a calming rumble. The mare's ears, which had been pinned back, flicked forward. She relaxed. James touched Sarah's shoulder and signed, "Good horse sense." She smiled, signing back with growing confidence. They are like people. Sometimes they just need silence. Their days fell into a rhythm, a dance of shared work. He taught her to read the coming weather in the shape of the clouds. She taught him to predict rain by the behavior of the birds, a skill from her village. In the garden, her Chinese planting methods, where certain plants protected others, fascinated him. He sketched her diagrams into the ledger. They rode the fence lines side by side. She'd traded her silk dresses for practical riding clothes, though she'd embroidered the cuffs with tiny, intricate Chinese symbols for luck. They'd stopped to repair a post, working in perfect sync, their hands signing quick messages, "Hold steady, pull tighter, done." Other ranchers who had first whispered about the strange pair now watched their efficiency with grudging admiration. But the peace of the ranch was an illusion. When they rode to town for supplies, the world pressed in. The Laram Weekly Herald was on the counter of the general store. A gossip column lay open. Sarah saw the words, "unusual arrangement" and "strange pair." The store owner's wife, Mrs. Crawford, watched her with narrowed eyes. "Will Mr. Mallister be settling this account?" she asked, her voice dripping with suspicion. "We don't usually offer credit to newcomers." Sarah simply placed the exact cash on the counter. Mrs. Crawford's lips tightened. "Speaking of reading," she said, her voice loud and sharp, "do your people actually know how, or is that journal of yours just full of pretty pictures?" Just then, the bell on the door chimed. James. He had a sixth sense for when the world's noise became too sharp for her. He smiled calmly at Mrs. Crawford and began signing to Sarah, his movements deliberately slow and elegant, a silent rebuke to the woman's ugliness. Mrs. Crawford just stared, her hostility momentarily replaced by bafflement. "Well, I never," she muttered. Outside, the whispers were louder. "That Chinese girl, the deaf rancher, it ain't natural." A group of children stopped to stare. One of them, a little girl with bright, curious eyes, held up the newspaper. It featured a cruel caricature of James and Sarah. But the girl wasn't interested in the drawing. "Can you teach me?" she asked, her voice a small, clear bell. "Can you teach me to talk with your hands?" Before they could respond, her mother rushed over, yanking her away. It was Mrs. Crawford. "Nancy, don't you bother these people." James just scribbled a note and showed it to the girl as she was pulled away. "Come to the ranch any time. We'll teach you." As they drove the wagon home, James was quiet. Sarah touched his arm and signed, "Their words are just noise. They can't touch us." He stopped the wagon at a bend in the road. From here, they could see their whole ranch spread out below them. The neat fences, the thriving garden, the horses grazing in the golden light. It was a picture of peace, a world they had built together. He wrote in his notebook, "Let them whisper. We will speak through our work." Sarah took the pencil and added a line below his, "And through what we teach." But she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The whispers were getting louder, and soon they would become a shout. Sarah's recipe book was a work of art. Chinese characters for her mother's recipes mingled with English notes on how to substitute Wyoming berries for lotus paste. Each page was another bridge she had built between her old life and her new one. Today, she was making mooncakes for Mrs. Henderson's preserve-making circle, a gathering of the town's most influential women. An invitation that had caused a stir. The kitchen was filled with the sense of baking and the low hum of female chatter. The 5 women watched, mesmerized, as Sarah folded the dough with intricate, practiced movements. "Look at the pattern it makes," whispered Mrs. Crawford, who had come despite herself. "It's like she's weaving." Sarah smiled and showed them how to crimp the edges, guiding their clumsy fingers with her own. When the golden patterned cakes came out of the oven, a collective sigh of appreciation filled the room. While they cooled, she served tea, the formal ceremony now a familiar comfort. The women's chatter subsided as they watched, a new respect dawning in their eyes. James, who had been sketching in the corner, caught her eye and signed, "Show them the garden." Outside, the women marveled at the unfamiliar herbs growing robustly alongside their familiar vegetables. Suddenly, Mrs. Crawford froze. Her daughter, Nancy, was in the paddock with Thunder, James's massive stallion. The girl's small hands were moving in careful, deliberate signs. "Nancy," Mrs. Crawford's voice was sharp with fear. James stepped forward, his notebook ready. "She has a gift with the horses. She comes to learn the signs. Thunder trusts her." As they watched, Nancy signed the command for "turn." The huge horse responded instantly, turning in a graceful circle. The girl's face was incandescent with pride. "She was so shy," Mrs. Crawford whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She hardly spoke a word to anyone." Sarah opened her recipe book to a blank page and wrote, "Sometimes the quietest hearts have the most to say. They just need to find their own language." The afternoon changed. The women's polite curiosity turned to genuine interest. They asked about her herbs, her planting methods, her life. By the time they left, their arms full of mooncakes, something had shifted. That evening, there was a knock on the door. It was Mrs. Crawford and Nancy. The older woman held out a jar of her prize-winning preserves, a peace offering. "Nancy was wondering," she said, not quite meeting Sarah's eyes, "if you would teach a proper class, for the children who need it, and maybe," she hesitated, "for their mothers too." Sarah's hands moved in a sign James had taught her, one that blended the Chinese character for open with the American sign for heart. "Every new language opens another heart," James translated. But just as this new door was opening, another was about to be slammed shut. The next morning, they found it. On the fence post nearest the road, gouged deep into the wood, were 2 words. One was a vicious slur against her heritage. The other was a crude drawing of a hand, its fingers broken and twisted. It was more than a warning. It was a promise of violence. The sky turned a bruised greenish black. James rushed to secure the old weather-beaten photograph of his parents, the only one he had. The horses moved restlessly in the paddock, their anxiety a low hum that vibrated through the ground. James read the signs in the sky and the animals just as Sarah read the warnings in her Chinese almanac. A bad storm was coming. Fast. Sarah grabbed her journal and sketched a quick plan, dividing the ranch into sections, assigning them each tasks. They worked in a blur of urgent, precise motion. No wasted movements, no hesitation. Their shared language of signs, honed over months, was now brutally efficient. The first fat drops of rain fell as they were reinforcing the garden. A crack of lightning lit James's face. He couldn't hear the thunder, but he felt it shake the earth. His hands flew in a sharp sign. "Storm cellar! Now!" But Sarah pointed to the far pasture. The new foal, born just a week before, had panicked. It had broken through a fence and was bolting straight for the creek, which was already beginning to swell into a muddy torrent. There was no time to argue. She pressed the photograph of his parents deeper into his pocket and signed, "I'm lighter, faster, trust me." Before he could protest, she was gone, a fleeting shape swallowed by the rain. She reached the creek just as the foal did. The water was a churning brown beast. The young horse reared as another lightning bolt split the sky. Sarah stood her ground. She began to hum, the low, vibrating lullaby she used to soothe the animals. The foal's ears flickered. It recognized her. Step by step, she moved closer, her hands making the slow, calming gestures James had taught her. The wind tore at her hair, the rain blinding her, but her movements were steady. The foal needed her certainty. Finally, her hand touched its trembling neck. At that moment, another flash of lightning showed her the creek had breached its banks. They had to move. Now. She guided the foal back, her feet sinking in the mud. Through the curtain of rain, she saw James emerge from the storm cellar, his hands raised, signing a path to the barn. They stumbled inside just as the full force of the storm hit, a screaming wall of wind and water. When the foal was safe and calm in a stall, James pulled her into a fierce, desperate hug. He drew back and signed, his hands shaking slightly. "Brave, foolish, perfect." She just smiled through her dripping hair and signed back, "Learned from you." In the storm cellar, lit by a single lantern, James showed her the photograph properly for the first time, his parents smiling. A world before the silence. Sarah traced their faces and signed, "They gave you strength." He took her hand. "You give me courage." But the storm wasn't the only battle they had to fight. As the rain hammered down, a rider appeared out of the gloom, half drowned and frantic. He stumbled into their barn with a message. A section of the main bridge into town had washed out, and a child was trapped on the other side. It was Mr. Patterson's youngest daughter. Patterson and his men were stuck miles away, unable to get back. The child was alone, and the river was rising. Going after her was a suicide mission. James started gathering ropes. He was going. Sarah stopped him. She looked at the frantic rider, then at James. She wrote a single stark question in her journal and showed it to them both. "Where?" The damaged fence post was a declaration of war. Vicious Chinese characters meaning outsider and curse were carved next to a mockery of James's ranch brand. Sarah traced the jagged edges with her finger. James touched her shoulder. Riders were approaching. It was Mr. Patterson, the man whose daughter Sarah had saved from the floodwaters just 2 days before. He was flanked by 2 members of the town council. He wasn't here to offer thanks. "Mallister," Patterson's voice boomed across the pasture. "We need to have a talk about this situation." James stepped in front of Sarah. Patterson ignored him, speaking with exaggerated slowness as if James were a simpleton. "The town is concerned. You two are teaching our children these foreign ways, these strange hand signals, filling their heads with unnatural ideas." Sarah opened her journal, but Patterson lunged forward and snatched it, throwing it in the mud. "No more of your chicken scratch. This is America. We speak English here." James's hands moved in a sign that was universally understood. his face a mask of cold fury. He moved to retrieve the journal, but a councilman blocked his path. "Now hold on, Mallister. You were odd enough before, but this—" He waved a hand at Sarah. "Teaching our children to be silent and strange like her. It ain't right." Sarah felt James trembling with a rage he couldn't voice. She calmly bent, picked up her journal, wiped it clean, and wrote in perfect, steady English. "Our students learn 3 languages: English, Chinese, and sign. Knowledge is not weakness." "Knowledge," Patterson spat. He kicked the defaced fence post. "You call this wickedness knowledge? For all we know, you're teaching them curses." Just then, Nancy Crawford came running toward them, her mother hurrying behind. Nancy's small hands were flying in the signs Sarah had taught her. "Miss Sarah, the foal is better." Mrs. Crawford arrived, breathless, and took in the scene. Her eyes fell on the muddied journal, then on Patterson's smug face. Something hardened in her expression. "Mr. Patterson," she said, her voice ringing with clarity. "My daughter barely spoke before Miss Sarah gave her a new way to be heard. Now she's top of her class in reading." She turned to the councilman. "And both your wives have been using her herbal remedies for weeks." Patterson's face darkened. "This isn't about herbs. It's about order." The second councilman laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Speaking of order, Mallister, we hear you never filed the proper ownership papers after your father passed. Been meaning to look into that." A cold dread washed over Sarah. She knew James's records were meticulous, but the threat was clear. They were coming for the ranch. "My father's papers are filed with the territorial office," James wrote, his hand rigid. "Certified copies are in the bank. Touch this ranch, and I will have the governor's office reviewing every land deal this council has ever approved." The councilmen shifted. They knew his reputation. It was a bluff, but a good one. Patterson glared at Sarah. "This isn't over. You don't belong here." As they rode away, Sarah took out her small carving knife. With precise, careful strokes, she began to alter the ugly carvings on the fence post. She didn't erase them. She transformed them. The slur became the character for strength. The curse became the character for family. She intertwined them with James's brand, surrounding it with a protective embrace. Below it all, she carved a new image. 2 hands, one dark and one light, clasped together. It was no longer a warning. It was a banner, a declaration of who they were and what they were building. But she knew the fight for the ranch, for their very existence here, had only just begun. The threat to James's land was not a bluff, it was a promise, and Patterson was a man who kept his promises. The wedding invitation was a work of art and defiance. Sarah's calligraphy flowed alongside James's steady English script. Illustrations of hands signing love and forever decorated the margins. It wasn't just an invitation, it was a statement to the whole town. "We could just marry quietly," James wrote. "Just us." Sarah's response was to dip her brush in fresh ink and continue. This was not the time for quiet. A frantic knock on the door brought grim news. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Crawford stood on the porch. The town council had called an emergency meeting. The topic: protecting community standards. It was happening tonight. It was a trap. James's jaw tightened, but Sarah was already reaching for the good coat she had worn on 5 failed journeys. Tonight, it would serve a new purpose. The town hall was packed, the air thick with hostility. Patterson was at the podium. "These foreign ways are a sickness," he thundered. "Our children babbling with their hands, our women using heathen herbs. Where does it end?" The whispers were a physical force, but this time Sarah saw friendly faces in the crowd. Her students, the mothers, the ranchers James had helped. Nancy Crawford pushed her way to the front, her small hands signing with a fierce elegance. Miss Sarah taught me to speak when my words were trapped in my heart. Her mother stood up. My daughter was called simple because she was quiet. Now she is teaching others. Tell me how that is a sickness. James stepped forward, but Sarah put a hand on his arm. It was her turn. She walked to the podium and stood before the large presentation slate. The room fell silent. She began to write. I came to America for a voice. I was told 5 times that my silence was a flaw, but silence has its own wisdom. Ask your horses, who trust a gentle hand more than a loud shout. Ask your gardens, which thrive on patient tending. Ask your children, who learn best when you listen not to their words, but to their hearts. She paused, the chalk hovering over the slate. James and I are getting married. We invite all of you. Come and see how love can speak in every language. She drew the Chinese character for harmony and then demonstrated its sign. A murmur went through the crowd. Mrs. Henderson stood. My arthritis hasn't bothered me since Sarah gave me her grandfather's tea. That's not heathen. That's wisdom. One by one, others stood. The blacksmith, a mother whose son's stutter had eased after learning to sign. It was a revolution, happening in whispers and signs. Patterson tried to regain control, but Mrs. Crawford's voice cut through his. Our way of life. Was it our way of life to let my Nancy cry herself to sleep, to call children slow because they were different, to fear wisdom because it came from a different place? James moved to stand beside Sarah. Together they held up their wedding invitation, a banner of 3 languages. The council chairman, who had been silent, cleared his throat. Seems to me, he said slowly, that any way of life worth a damn has room to grow. Motion to dismiss. He smiled faintly. And I believe I hear wedding bells. But as the crowd celebrated, Sarah saw Patterson conferring with the other councilman. He wasn't just defeated, he was enraged. He pointed a finger toward James, then made a gesture she didn't understand, drawing a line in the air with his thumb. A line like a border. She realized with a cold shock, the fight for their hearts was won. The fight for their land was about to begin, and it would be a war. The community notice board was a tapestry of their new world. Bilingual postings, diagrams of simple signs. It had become the town's heart. Sarah pinned up a notice for the next signing class, which had grown so large they now used the church basement. Mrs. Crawford came out of the general store, her arms full. Sarah, I'm trying to stock some of those herbs you use. Figured it's time this town learned properly. In the street, James was leading a horse-gentling session for a group of ranchers. His silent methods, once viewed with suspicion, were now in high demand. It's something, isn't it? Mrs. Crawford said, watching. He taught them all to listen with their eyes. Makes you wonder what else we've been missing. The town was changing. Children ran past, playing games that mixed English, Chinese, and signs. Mr. Roberts, the postmaster, was helping a young mother learn the sign for milk for her nonverbal son. A deaf child from a neighboring town was now living in Laram just to attend their school. Word had spread. A letter from the territorial governor's wife was now posted on the board, praising their program and asking for their help in creating others. It felt like a dream. A fragile, beautiful dream. The dream shattered the next morning. The sheriff arrived with 2 men Sarah didn't recognize. They carried surveying equipment. He handed James an official-looking document. It was a court order. An old, obscure territorial law had been discovered by Patterson's lawyer in Cheyenne. It stated that any land grant not actively and continuously improved, according to a strict set of definitions, could be subject to challenge and reclamation. The law was designed to target speculators, but it was being twisted to target them. Their garden, their new classroom, even the repaired fences, None of it fit the law's archaic definition of improvement, which specified certain types of crops and structures. "They filed a claim, James," the sheriff said, his face grim. "They're saying your father abandoned the land, legally speaking, by not farming it the proper way. Patterson and the council are claiming it for the township." It was a lie, a perversion of the law, but it was legal. They had 30 days to prove in court that their improvements, their blended garden, their school, their entire way of life, had more value than the letter of a dead law. 30 days until they could lose everything, not just the ranch, but the world they had built, the community that was just learning to speak. The blizzard came without warning, a white fury that buried the world in silence. For 3 days, the storm raged. Their ranch became a sanctuary. The Hendersons, the Crawfords, and a dozen other families found shelter with them, their own homes threatened by the crushing weight of the snow. James moved through the crowded house, a calm center in the chaos. The barn became an ark, filled with their neighbors' most vulnerable livestock. Sarah's kitchen table was a dispensary of Chinese herbs and Western medicines, labeled in 3 languages. The children, wrapped in blankets by the fire, practiced signing stories about the storm, their small hands shaping words for snow, wind, safe. The storm cut them off from the world, but it bound them together. Then thunder's warning stamp came from the barn, a vibration of pure alarm. James felt it and was moving instantly. They found a young ranch hand, half frozen in the doorway. He'd ridden through the hell of the storm with a message. The Hendersons' oldest boy was trapped at their collapsed homestead. A rescue party was formed. But what amazed everyone was how the command center operated. Without a single raised voice, messages were relayed by signing children. Supplies were organized with written notes, and tasks were coordinated with a shared language of gestures. People who had resisted learning now watched, learned, and communicated out of sheer necessity. During the long, tense hours of waiting, Sarah started a quilt. She taught the women to stitch their own family patches together with hers, blending calico with silk, American patterns with Chinese luck symbols. The repetitive motion calmed their frayed nerves. Near midnight, the rescue party returned, successful. The Henderson boy was safe. As Sarah tended to his frostbite, she saw Mrs. Patterson, Patterson's own wife, who had sought refuge with them, using the signs she had learned just hours before to ask for more bandages. When the sky finally cleared, something had changed. The storm had forced them to speak each other's languages, to rely on silent understanding. The finished quilt, a tapestry of every family present, was a testament to what they had survived together. As families began to dig out, Sarah found a note tucked into her medicine box from Mrs. Patterson. "Some strength comes without sound. Thank you for teaching us to listen." But their victory was short-lived. A week later, another rider came, a lawyer from Cheyenne. He brought news of their court date. It had been moved up to tomorrow. Patterson had used the storm as an opportunity. While the town was isolated and recovering, he had pushed the legal challenge through a sympathetic judge. They had less than 24 hours to prepare a defense for their entire way of life. Sarah looked at the quilt, the symbol of their united community. Then she looked at the legal notice. The storm had brought them together. But Patterson was about to use the law to tear them all apart. The courtroom was a pressure cooker. Patterson and his lawyer laid out their case with cold, legal precision. They cited the archaic law, presented surveys, and argued that James Mallister's ranch was legally unimproved and therefore forfeit. It was a lie wrapped in the language of the law. The judge, a man with cold eyes and a clear alliance with Patterson, seemed ready to rule. Despair settled over their friends in the gallery. Then James stood up. He did not use his notebook. He walked to the front of the courtroom and began to sign. His hands moved not with anger, but with a powerful, deliberate grace. Nancy Crawford, standing beside him, was his voice, translating for the court. He didn't talk about the law. He told the story of the land. He spoke of his father, who had let fields go fallow to preserve the soil for future generations. He spoke of the native grasses he cultivated, which were hardier than any crop and held the land together during droughts. He spoke of the horses, bred for strength and endurance, an improvement to the very stock of the territory. His silence, a thing the town had once pitied, was now a voice of profound authority. Then Sarah took his place. She didn't write in her journal. She unrolled a series of large, masterful drawings she had stayed up all night creating. They were plans, blueprints for the future. She showed them the school, with schematics for new classrooms. She showed them the expanded training center for horses, with letters of support from ranchers across the territory. She showed them the community garden, with detailed notes on crop rotation and trade agreements that would benefit the entire town. She was showing them not what the ranch was, but what it was becoming. An engine of prosperity and community. Patterson's lawyer objected. "This is irrelevant. Hopes and drawings are not legal improvements." "Aren't they?" A new voice cut through the room. It was Mrs. Patterson. She walked to the front, holding an old tattered ledger. "My husband claims this land was abandoned, but this is my father-in-law's ledger. It documents a loan, made 30 years ago, from James's father to my husband's father. A loan that saved the Patterson Ranch from foreclosure during the Great Drought." She opened the ledger. The loan was never repaid in cash. The final entry reads, "Debt paid in full by the promise of friendship and mutual aid. The North Pasture water rights are yours for as long as you need them." James's father didn't abandon this land. He shared it. That, Your Honor, is the highest form of improvement I can imagine. A gasp went through the courtroom. Patterson was stunned into silence, his own family's history used as a weapon against his greed. The judge, seeing the tide turn against him, had no choice. He slammed his gavel down. Claim denied. The celebration spilled out into the town square. But James and Sarah weren't finished. That afternoon, they filed a new document with the court. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a proposal. They formally deeded a portion of their land, the very section Patterson had tried to steal, to the township, with one condition, that it be used to create a public park and school, managed by a board of citizens. The very people in that courtroom, they hadn't just saved their ranch, they had given it away, ensuring it could never be threatened again. They had transformed a weapon of greed into a tool of community. The wedding was held a month later in the newly designated park. The traditional Chinese wedding dress Sarah wore was stitched with Wyoming wildflowers. James's brother, Thomas, stood beside him, his hands confidently signing "brother." Sarah's sister, May, stood beside her, translating the Chinese blessings for the ranchers. The wedding certificate was signed by the entire town, a tapestry of English script, Chinese characters, and hand-drawn signs. A year later, the Mallister School of Languages and Horsemanship was a beacon. Families came from all over the territory, seeking a place where their quiet children could be heard. Sarah stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the big sky. She was writing one last letter to Mrs. Sullivan at the marriage agency. "You said America needed a different kind of woman," she wrote. "You were right, and we needed a different kind of America, so we decided to build it." James came and wrapped his arms around her. He pointed to the horizon, where the mountains stood in silent majesty. "Look," he signed against her palm, his touch as familiar as her own heartbeat. "Our voice is carrying." They had been rejected for being too quiet, but their silence had become a roar, a symphony of community, courage, and a love that spoke a language everyone could understand. They had built a world not on words, but on the spaces in between, proving that the most powerful voices are often the ones that don't make a sound. If this story reminded you that there are many ways to be heard, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because the stories we share here are all about finding the light in the most unexpected places. And don't forget to join us tomorrow for another story you won't want to miss.